Hey, what's up, y'all? Before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know about a raffle competition thing that I'm running over the next 2 weeks. I want to give away a 5-volume set of the Summa Theologiae. Very expensive, but I want to send that to one of you for free. I also want to give 10 copies of my book, Does God Exist? A Socratic Dialogue on the 5 Ways of Thomas Aquinas away. So there will be 11 winners in total. How do you enter? I hear you ask. Well, here's how you enter. I would like you to tweet at Dave Rubin and tell him to have Matt Fradd on his show. All right, so there's 3 things you got to do. You got to tag him, right, at, I think it's Rubin Report. Tag me at Matt Fradd on your show. And the third thing you have to do is put my URL, mattfradd.com, so you can learn more about me. I would love to go on Dave Rubin's show. He's got a lot of people who watch. And one of the things I'd love to talk about is how pornography is detrimental and how you don't have to be a religious person to agree with that. So many of you know that I have another podcast called Love People Use Things. And I actually co-host it with my atheist friend, Noah Church. We disagree about a lot, obviously, but the one thing we agree about is that the world will be better off without sexual exploitation. So this week and next week, as I say, tweet at Dave Rubin, tell him to have me, Matt Fradd, on his show, and that is how you enter the raffle to win, and I'll let you know in a couple of weeks whether or not you won. Also, guess what I'm doing next week? Can you guess? Okay, I'll just tell you. I'm interviewing Bishop Robert Barron about the Holy Eucharist. I just recorded the episode. It was really fantastic, and you're going to completely love it. So if you haven't subscribed to Pints with Aquinas on iTunes or wherever you listen to these, be sure to do that. Okay? Here's the show. Hey, welcome to Pints with Aquinas. My name's Matt Fradd. If you could sit down over a pint of beer with Thomas Aquinas and ask him any one question, what would it be? My wife just said something funny. That's why I'm laughing. Today we are joined around the bar table by Father Gregory Pine. Him and me and Thomas Aquinas are going to discuss what makes music beautiful. So buckle up. Good to have you back here at Pints with Aquinas. This is the show where you and I pull up a bar stool next to the angelic doctor to discuss theology and philosophy. This was such a great episode. I'm so excited to bring it to you today. We discuss lots of different things. Like, here's just some random things we discuss, okay? We discuss the transcendentals. We touch upon things like Freddy Krueger. Don't know why, but somehow that came up. We talk about beauty. We talk about trees and Gregorian chant and Hillsong. It really was a great discussion. I also get to ask Father, if Thomas Aquinas would listen to Metallica today. We also talk about what kind of stuff he listens to while he works out. Really, we just discuss everything. It was a great show. Father Gregory Pine went to his local library where he had good internet connection, and we just chatted. And you are going to love this show. And this is why Pints with Aquinas exists, to bring people who are much smarter than you and me to educate you and me about the beauty of the Catholic Church through the lens of Thomas Aquinas. Please enjoy the show. All right? Please enjoy the show. Grab a beer. Here we go. What drew you to the Dominican order?
So St. Thomas Aquinas, in short. I went to Franciscan University of Steubenville, and during my first year at school there, I went to a lecture given by a woman who teaches at St. Louis University named Eleanor Stump, and she spoke about Aquinas and the nature of love, and she spoke about love in a way that I had never, I just never experienced it in that way. She was clear, she was precise, she was probing, it was profound, it was radiant, and I just found myself drawn to the thought of this man, St. Thomas, who I'd never encountered before. And so I just started reading whatever St. Thomas I could find, and it was actually like one of these Lives of the Saints by Louis de Wohl called The Quiet Light, which is more so historical fiction than it is really anything beyond that. And just the quality of his holiness I just found incredibly attractive. So yeah, before then I'd had the desire to be, a saint. I wanted to be perfect. I wanted to be holy. I wanted to be entirely given to the Lord, but I'd never really seen how those things were to come together concretely in my own life. And then just through this encounter with St. Thomas and his love of the Lord, it just resonated, and I found that it was substantial. It had a claim on my life.
Did you give Did you give the Dominicans a call after that, and how did you get introduced to them specifically?
I did, right, yeah. So fortunately, so he was a Dominican, as we all know, and fortunately the Dominicans still exist 750 years later.
Woo!
It would have been a shame to, fall in love with the order of, Grand Monts, whatever. So I called up the Eastern Province, and I had a friend at school who had a friend from back home who was being ordained a deacon in the province. And so I first went to his ordination, and then I made more frequent visits, and it was all gravy from that point on.
That's cool. I'm sure that puts some, just like flesh, as it were, on the whole desire, because I've heard that when people visit particular religious orders that they end up joining, they say, well, it just felt like home. Is that what it was like for you? Or?
Right. Yeah, I would use those words, I think, capture it perfectly. Another thing that I usually say is, it was like meeting a friend. So some people are overwhelmed by the choice of a vocation, and they feel like they have to make an exhaustive search of all of the different possibilities. But what I found was it was like meeting your best friend. You can't really account for how you came together, but then you look back and realize that person, fit at that time and made life beautiful and livable and lovable. And so it was just, I met this community, and I never really looked at any other. And I recognized the fact that it was for me, and that was that.
That's really cool. Yeah, I mean, I certainly feel like that about my wife. It's like she was like my best friend. I remember for the two of us, our biggest fear was that we were actually just really good friends, but maybe we weren't physically attracted, and we just wish we were physically attracted, because if we were, that would be amazing because we're such good friends. And then we ended up being like,
that's incredible,
massive
mind game.
Oh, it was awesome. And then turned out we were massively attracted to each other, and that's it, man. 4 kids later. Woo!
I congratulate you on having discerned well.
Yeah, it's a joy. Yeah. So let's talk about beauty and beautiful music. First thing I need to ask you is, would Thomas Aquinas have listened to Metallica, yes or no?
Give me fuel, give me fire, give me that which I desire.
If he was alive today.
Well, St. Thomas Aquinas had more of a southern Mediterranean disposition, and I would say Metallica is more Teutonic in its origins. So I think he would shy away from it. I think he would be a big fan of bluegrass. And all mandolin influenced music.
And no, so I don't understand those words you just said. What does Teutonic mean? And
Teutonic, like North Germany, like those associated with the North Sea, kind of taller, more gloomy, melancholic types. It just, that kind of sadness doesn't come naturally to St. Thomas, or that kind of anger, I don't think.
Yeah,
he's just too...
That's interesting. What if Thomas Aquinas was doing CrossFit and he needed something to get him through the WOD?
Wow, that's an excellent... Probably the soundtrack of Godfather 2.
Okay, cool.
It'd be more like a haunting kind of melancholy dirge, but still Southern Mediterranean.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So I guess the Italian disposition has you tend to associate the Italians with joy and festivity, don't you? I guess for good reason.
And they cry easily too.
Yeah,
which is said of St. Thomas with celebrating the Mass. So yeah, he's real Italian.
Why do you think it is? It seems like they had more respect for tears back then than we do, even in Catholic circles. Like, it seems like even in Catholic circles today, if I was to see a priest crying all the time, I'd be like, oh, for goodness sake, pull it together.
I suspect that they probably had a healthier appreciation of the emotional life in general. We're downstream of a lot of hilarious tendencies in history that have suppressed male emotion for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is, Victorian England. Yeah, and also, like, our country is super influenced by Irish, those of an Irish extraction. So there are a few things as mortifying as for an Irishman to cry.
That's actually a really good point, right? Because when you think of Thomas, you think of the Dominicans, you think of, like, cerebral, abstract, not in touch with the emotions. But it's that's just one of the evidences that wasn't at all the case with Thomas Aquinas. In fact, that was one of his 5 remedies for sorrow: tears and groaning.
That's right. In addition to taking baths and drinking wine.
I love that it's not just tears. It's like you want to cry and you want to groan. So don't be crying quietly. You need to do ugly cry.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. No, for sure. I think it's perfect. It's eminently sensible.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to talk about music and what makes music beautiful. I want to eventually touch upon liturgical music and what's ghastly, what's more appropriate, what's somewhere in the middle. But before we do that, what does beautiful even mean? What is that?
Right. So when St. Thomas talks about beauty, he says that we call those things beautiful, which, when seen, please. So at first look, it doesn't seem to be the most, mind-blowing of definitions. It's like, oh yeah, I could have told you that. But there is this sense in which beauty is a vision. It's something that's intuitive. It's something that happens to you almost. And it gives you this kind of delight. There's a delight in knowing it without going through the steps or without cognizing it. You're not like making a syllogism. Mm-hmm. This thing is nice looking things are beautiful, therefore this thing is beautiful. It's a kind of apparition. It's something that visits itself upon you. So yeah, like whenever St. Thomas talks about beauty, he often talks about it in the context of the transcendentals, which get a lot of press. So like being one, true, good, beautiful. And we usually just give the trifecta of the true, the good, and the beautiful. But effectively, when describing the transcendentals, he's describing things that you always encounter whenever you can encounter something that is. So on account of the fact that you encounter a being, it's also true that it's undivided. That is to say, it's one. It has a kind of unity to it. It's also true. That is to say, it's addressed to your mind. And then it's also good, which is to say that your appetite, your love reaches for that thing in some way. And then it's beautiful, which is to say that it has this kind of radiance or clarity, or it has this kind of way of addressing you as something made for you, as something pleasing for you.
All right, I want to pause here, and I want us to kind of backpedal and re-go over that, because we have all sorts of people who listen to this podcast, and I'm sure a lot of them want to have a better handle on the transcendentals. So I'm thinking of Aristotle's categories, like substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, all that. So a substance can be, and you tell me if this isn't me saying, I don't know if this is true or not, so you correct me. So when we talk about a substance, I guess we're just talking about a being. Is that synonymous with being in this sense? Substance, being?
When he sure, yeah. When Aristotle describes substance, he does it, well, in the context of that discussion, he'll say this: being can be said in many ways. Being is most properly said of a substance, because a substance is what exists in itself. It's proper to it to exist. Right. So like a substance is like a plant, like a tree, or an animal, or a person, or an angel. Mm-hmm. So it's something to which it pertains to exist. And then the other things that you described, so accidents, the word accidents comes from the Latin accidere, which just means to happen to or to befall. Cool. Accidents are things that inhere in a substance. So like you said, quality, quantity, time, place, habit, posture, passion, action. Those are things that
can change without destroying the substance.
Exactly. It pertains to those things to inhere in the substance. So like when you have an animal, it's true that it is brown. It's true that it is, four-footed. It's true that it is, sharp-toothed, if that's an accurate passive participle. And those would be accidents. Those are things that aren't essential in the same way that it is essential to be a bear.
Okay, so when we talk about
Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, when we talk about a substance, while all aren't the same height, all aren't the same color, all aren't in the same position, all don't exist at the same time, you're saying when we talk about transcendentals, I guess just etymologically, that word you tell me, what does that mean etymologically?
Right, etymologically. So it means that it transcends, so it steps through or over all of the categories.
Okay, there you
go.
So
like you said, there's a category of substance, and then there's these 9 categories of accidents. So the transcendentals transcend all 10 categories. So whenever we encounter a substance, whenever we encounter quality, and hearing in a substance, it's always true that those things have being after a manner, that those things are one. that they're true, that they're good, that they're beautiful. So yeah, they're called transcendentals because they transcend all 10 categories.
So why does everything which exists have to be good? Yeah, some people listening may have been told, well, Satan's evil. You can't possibly say Satan's good.
Sure. So I guess one kind of parenthetical thing is, so evil in the Thomistic tradition, according to St. Augustine and those who follow him, is a privation of the good. So evil isn't something that actually exists. Mm-hmm. What evil describes is a disorder or a lack, or basically something that ought to be there but isn't. So the classic example that comes up a lot is blindness. So blindness is evil because so for a human being, for instance, you ought to have sight. And if you don't have sight, that's something that we would describe as, and is in fact, evil. Mm-hmm. But for instance, we wouldn't say that plants are blind. Or if we did say that, we would be saying it metaphorically. So it's not evil that plants can't see because it doesn't pertain to them as plants to have eyes, right? So an evil describes what ought to be there but isn't. Mm-hmm. So effectively what we're describing is relative non-being. Now, mind you, relative non-being can be a real pain in the butt and can cause you incredible sorrow, but still, metaphysically speaking, it's relative non-being. So everything that is good. Which is to say this simply, it has some allure to it. It has something about it that draws us. It has something about it that can be assimilated, that can build you up, that can bring you to perfection. So like, even if it's the most inconsequential thing, like a piece of bazooka gum, it can still bring 5 cents worth of delight, you know? Mm-hmm. So that's what, we're not saying that it's good in the sense of like morally excellent.
Yeah.
Right.
But
it's just to say that
would you say
metaphysically,
would this be a right saying, like, in as much as something is, it is good, or is in as much as something is actualized?
Right. Yeah. And like you can bring this to a point when you describe things that we would understand as evil. So, like you said, for instance, we would tend to think about Satan as like pure evil, mm-hmm. but he is. So he has his own active existence. He subsists in the nature of an angel. And God continues to create. Creation is this ongoing act. So God continues to support Satan in being.
I love it.
And Satan, he uses Satan for the testing of his saints. Again, don't think about God as like creepy and testing people, but he permits Satan to work in the world for the sake of, bringing about a greater good. Yeah. And so it's somehow good that Satan is. So too of even like sinful acts, for instance. So if you steal something, right, you commit a sinful act. Now there's a disorder in that act, so you had the options of whether to observe justice or not. You didn't. So you introduced a perversion into that act, as a result of which we call it evil, bad, boo-hoo, right? But in as much as you exercised agency, there is an act there, and there's something good about it, and God supports that in being. So you were deficient in the way you brought it about, and you introduced evil as a result. But there's actually something good in your actualizing of that potency, as you said.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so if evil's the absence of being, and Satan, if he was to be entirely evil, that would be to say, well, he would not exist. So I suppose the reason we say Satan is so evil is because he is so much greater than the rest of us. And so does that make sense?
Or
like
because
I think it's like Lewis said this, right? Like a cow can't be very evil. Like I can. Yeah. Someone much smarter than me can. Satan even more so.
Right. And even with like, you can think of how Aristotle and Plato describe political systems. The corruption of the best is the worst. So in their understanding, monarchy or a constitutional monarchy would have been the best political system.
Yep.
But the worst is the corruption of that, which would be despotism. Mm-hmm. So you can think about like, we hear it said that Satan fell by his gravity. So Satan, who was among the highest ranks of angels, numbered among the seraphim, falls to the very pits of hell. It's not insignificant, for instance, that in Dante's Divine Comedy, there are 9 rings of hell. There are also 9 choirs of angels, and Satan pertained to the highest of the 9, the seraphim. And so he occupies the complete reverse place in the underworld. So because he was such an exalted being, when you introduce evil into an exalted being, it's all the more terrible.
Yeah, I had never thought about what you just said before. It was fascinating. Like, obviously, God sustains everything in being. And so sometimes people have this idea of God and Satan be on equal footing, which of course isn't true. But even further, as you say, God even sustains his very existence in being. That's powerful, eh?
It is. And that's something, I mean, I think it's something beautiful to meditate on the long suffering God, the extent to which God permits things that are terrible or bad, but for the manifestation of his glory, for the bringing about of his providential designs.
Yeah.
It's just, I find that infinitely fascinating.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we've got a better understanding of what the transcendentals are then. Do we want to talk about those three things Aquinas says everything beautiful has?
Right. Let's do it.
All right.
So St. Thomas says that there are three properties of all beautiful things. The first he calls integrity, or we could just say wholeness. The next he calls something like consonance or proportionality. And then the third and final is clarity. We could also say radiance. So the first, integrity or wholeness, basically the thing it must not be deficient in what it needs to be most itself.
Excellent way of putting it.
It just has to have what it needs to be itself. So like you imagine in your mind a tree, and you have in your mind something that has deep enough roots so as not to fall over. I once went to Sequoia National Park and walked around in the tall trees grove, and they said you have to be careful about walking too much on the roots of sequoia trees because apparently they're pretty superficial, and the way they stand up is because they're all interlocked, which seems crazy, but whatever. So like you picture a tree with the roots that go deep into the soil. You picture a big healthy trunk, maybe like a little hole in the middle for an owl to hang out, and then a number of branches that are proportionately thick, and then they branch out and they have whatever. Maybe they're flowering, maybe it's blossoming, maybe it's you got leaves, maybe the leaves are turning, whatever. But you just picture something that has all of these parts. So it's got to have roots, it's got to have a trunk, it's got to have big limbs branching into smaller limbs, and they've got to be filled with leaves. So yeah, if like, for instance, that tree were struck by lightning and a third of it just calved off the tree and landed in your yard and felled your power lines and set the lawn on fire, that would represent, one, a tragedy, two, also a lack of integrity on the part of the tree, because it would be efficient in what it needs to be most itself, which leads pretty seamlessly into the next feature, which is proportionality. And so basically here we understand that its dimensions should suitably correspond to other physical objects as well as to a kind of ideal, so that it should be harmonious, it should be balanced, it should be symmetrical, it should be proportionate. So here you can think of like, if one of the limbs of the tree were thicker than the trunk, you'd be like, wow, bizarre, limb trunk limb, weird. It wouldn't make sense with respect to the whole, and it wouldn't make sense with respect to the ideal of how trees ought to work, because, it distributes its nutrients. I don't actually know how trees work. I shouldn't go into anything resembling biology, or I'll just embarrass myself. So all of the parts should be proportioned and balanced.
I'm just thinking now, like if there was a tree in my front yard and for some reason a branch was sticking out such that the tree was no longer proportioned, even if it wasn't creating some sort of safety hazard, even if it wasn't about to hit the power lines, I think most people, including myself, would want to cut that back, and what we're trying to do is to make it proportioned. Like that alone is a good enough reason for getting up the ladder and bringing out the saw, as it were.
Right, yeah, because you want to look out your window and see a beautiful tree. You don't want to see a tree with a monster limb. It's just offensive.
Yeah. And this is why, I suppose, this is why the monsters that we see on television, it's almost like the more human they look, the more creepy they are, because it's like there's a lack of integrity, a lack of proportion. So if it doesn't resemble a human being in any sense, it's not that scary. But if it looks like a human being, does that make sense? Like those horror movies, like Freddy Krueger and all those sorts of things with like a deformity in it. So it's kind of like a human being, but not. Those seem to be the creepiest.
Sure. And also, too, because I think for reasons that Aristotle describes with respect to tragedy, you can also see yourself more in a monster that looks more like you. So it's almost like you fear the chemical accident or the freak. I don't know what Marvel's up to these days. The freak symbiote that could affect that in your own members, because it's like it's close enough for you to sympathize, but far enough for you to be fearful.
I see.
So there's a sense that you recognize a form, you recognize the form of a human person, and then you see how this this, like problem has been introduced, and as a result of which it's all the more horrifying, rather than if it were just to be this completely
alien
made
creature,
up and nonsensical creature. Yeah, if like Tinky Winky from the Teletubbies came, you'd be like, ha.
If you had that weird, creepy, high-pitched voice and seemed sweet but was actually evil, that would freak me out. But anyway, all right. Well, those two totally make sense. And so what we're doing here is like we're trying to establish this objective criteria for beauty, which I think right away is going to offend some people because we keep being told that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Is there any truth to that?
I think there is a certain truth to that, in as much as cross-culturally you have a wide array of, like what people think of what is beautiful. And also, over the course of centuries, for instance, what's in vogue changes with every passing generation. Okay. So some of that is just by auto-suggestion from those on Madison Avenue. It could just be a matter of, just like passing trends. But things that really strike to the heart of the matter, things that pertain directly to what constitutes human nature and how human nature is to be perfected in the physical form, I think those are perduring, and those stand the test of time. But yeah, certain things about it. Certain things will be fashionable that to subsequent generations look crazy. Like mullets. Mullets were beautiful in the 80s.
I don't believe that at all.
They're less so now.
Yeah. Well, and I used this analogy with you the other day when we were speaking. Like I can imagine somebody seeing, say, a 3-legged dog and half an ear, perhaps, like, walking towards us as best as it could. And you might imagine somebody saying, "Oh, look at the beautiful little thing." But even there, I'm not sure that they mean beautiful. I think what they're doing is expressing pity and using the word beautiful in place of something, a word that they should have used, Right.
Yeah, I think exactly. It's just, it moves you emotionally to want to remove the source of that animal's pain or suffering, and you have this kind of effective draw and response. But also, as you described this too.
I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. I don't know how frustrating that's getting. Just one thing.
No, not the least.
Even if you see like a tree, like that's, like I used to live in Ireland in the north, and there'd be these trees where all of the branches grew on one side because it, existed in this sort of wind tunnel of sorts. Now, you might say that is a beautiful tree, but I think what you mean when you say that is a unique, interesting, bizarre looking tree, but I'm not sure if beautiful would be the right word, or maybe it would.
I think with something like that, you can marvel at the way in which the tree has adapted to its circumstances. So here it is in this inhospitable clime, in these, in this strange Emerald Isle, and yet it's managed to make the best of life, even if that means looking hilarious. So I wouldn't say like it's not going to make the top 12 beautiful trees, coverfold. But it may come up in planet Earth because we're infinitely fascinated in the way that things survive or in the way that things flourish in adverse circumstances. So it's almost more like we marvel at the tree's courage, speaking metaphorically, than we do at its beauty.
Yeah, that makes sense. The next one I find the most difficult to understand, so let's spend some time on that. What did you call it? Claritas or
Right, so yeah, clarity or radiance.
Right.
Radiance. So again, the first one was integrity or wholeness, the second one was consonance or proportionality, and the third and final is clarity or radiance. And basically what this describes is that a beautiful thing clearly radiates intelligibility, which is to say that the logic of its inner being impresses itself upon the mind of the perceiver. So basically, when you see something beautiful, you see the work of an intelligence addressed to an intelligence. So there's a kind of communication that goes between the artisan and the critic, or the one who gazes upon the thing made. And this is especially true, or comes out most powerfully in created things, in things that have God as their cause. So you can look at the delicacy or the subtlety of the inner workings of the human hand, and there's a kind of beauty to it, and it leads you to marvel at a kind of, without getting into any debate about evolutionary biology or intelligent design, not my intention. You can marvel at the intelligence at work in something that complex and subtle and fearfully and wonderfully made. So you see that in a work of art. It's like the artist has the form of the thing in his mind before he ever sets brush to canvas. And then he's able to communicate something of his own interior life his own thought world, and then that can address you from the canvas itself. So that's what we mean when we say clarity. It's not just a matter of like bright colors or of, a sweet backdrop. It's a matter of intelligibility somehow addressing itself to you.
Is this why mud isn't beautiful? Because it just seems like doesn't seem like there's anything in particular trying to express itself to you. Is that what you mean, or no?
Sure. I mean, another example would be like a heap of trash. So this would be an example that like Dietrich von Hildebrand would bring up the difference between, the coherence or the unity of a heap of trash and then some organic being, right? So like we're made up of parts, hands and feet and et cetera. And those things all come together in an intelligible way for one express purpose, which we know supernaturally is, to know, love, and serve God and to enjoy him in the next. But with like a heap of junk, basically it showed up there somewhat by accident, and it has no express purpose except to be a heap of junk. And so we wouldn't say that it's beautiful because there's no intelligence being poured into it and there's no intelligence radiating from it. So too of mud. I mean, yeah, like mud, dirt, I suppose, can be beautiful in a way when it's in its context or when it's arranged well, when it's not blowing your house down in like 1932 Dust Bowl times. But it lacks the coherence of higher order things.
So why isn't mud as beautiful as a tree? Would we then point back to the first two things, proportionality and integrity? Or
I think we can describe all three. So like, for instance, a tree is a living thing. So a tree has, this is whatever, speculative philosophy. A tree has a vegetative soul. Mm-hmm. And with life comes a certain intelligibility, right? We would say that living things are higher ordered than non-living things because there's a vitality, whatever, to speak somewhat unhelpfully. There's a vitality to them that exceeds the mere mineral. I'm just using adjectives as nouns. Whatever. Deal with it. Okay. So living things are higher in the order of being than non-living things. So more, in a certain sense, more intelligibility has been poured into them. You can inquire more of a tree than you can of mud. For instance, if you devoted your life to studying mud, and you were to explain to people like, yeah, I wrote my PhD dissertation on like exploratory mud studies in late 1950s Korea with the plight of post-nationalistic, war-torn, blah, blah, blah. They'd be like, wow, that's so depressing. But if you were to say like, hey, I studied biology, people would be like, yeah, that makes more sense because there's actually there's more there to be studied. Now, I don't mean to make light of geology and its importance, but that's just to say that it's infinitely more fascinating and alluring and intelligible to study things that are, because they're more complex. They betray a deeper intelligence.
But it's not just a matter of whatever's higher on the chain of being is more beautiful, is it? Or is it? Because it sounds like that's what you were saying.
That is kind of what I'm saying. Let me pause.
Yeah.
And I think that things higher on the chain of being have a greater capacity to be beautiful. So again, you get into fine shades. Like for instance, would I rather stand on Point Imperial on the north rim of the Grand Canyon and look over it, or would I rather like look at, I don't know, Jessica Smith from Davenport, Iowa? Like in the moment, especially if I'm close to Arizona, I prefer to look at the Grand Canyon. Mm-hmm. But that just shows like, for instance, just one feature of beauty. So for instance, there's a beauty to friendship that I can never share with the Grand Canyon. Yeah, there's a sublimity. Yeah, there's an awesomeness to it. But there's also far richer avenues of exploration with human friendship on account of the fact that humans are higher in the order of being. We have souls, that we have a supernatural destiny, that we have aspirations that exceed those of rock and silt and water. So I think at the end of the day, that's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah, I think I am saying that.
How do you, so artwork isn't, higher on the chain of being than mud, I suppose, and yet, I mean, it's more beautiful than mud. Is that because, right. But it's usually depicting something higher on the chain of being. Is that what
yes. And also too, like with artwork, you have the visible impress of man as rational. So it is clearly a work, an artifact of man who is a rational animal, and he is pouring his own intelligent life into that thing. So again, it's his intelligence is addressed to you through that thing. So the divine intelligence is addressed to us through all created things, but after the manner of, kind of steps, gradations. So more with higher ordered beings, but man has the capacity also to fashion tools and to speak with language and to make art. This is a sign of his sublimity, of his high dignity, of his supreme calling. And so he can actually communicate that to his contemporaries and to his, whatever ancestors, which is kind of wild when you think about it.
So, okay, what about Mother Teresa? Like, say you don't know that she's a saint, say she's not wearing a habit. That's not a beautiful face.
Right. I don't know. I mean, some people have had just intuitive experiences of her as beautiful. Like Malcolm Muggeridge had a conversion as a result of his experience with her. You know, it was something.
But wouldn't
something
that be the virtue that we'd want to describe as beautiful?
Sure.
Like, I think, isn't that true? Like, when people say Mother Teresa was beautiful and you could tell she was beautiful, I think that had more to do with her sanctity, didn't it, than her outward appearance?
I think that's certainly the case. But also, I think that sin has a way of deforming a human person. And I think that virtue has a way of perfecting in a way that doesn't necessarily come through in like Chantilly lace and a pretty face, but like that has a kind of radiance to it. Here's what I'm thinking of is, Oscar Wilde's book, Portrait of Dorian Gray. So his face doesn't change, but the portrait itself betrays all of the ravages of sin. I think there is a sense in which our faces are transfigured by our moral lives.
What does that mean, though? I mean, that sounds too mystical to understand.
And that's me being philosophically irresponsible and giving way to poetry.
I think you're right. Like, I tend to agree with you. And my grandma was a very holy woman, and I would look at her and I'm like, she's just beautiful. I don't even know what I mean by that. She's just lovely. I like to look at her. But I think that had partly to do with the fact that she was joyful, she would smile, she would tell jokes, she would make me feel welcomed and loved.
I think it's very difficult to reduce human beauty to just what is seen initially, because it always involves this I, thou kind of second person knowledge. Like, as you grow in knowledge and understanding of a human person, you're able to appreciate better who that person is and how they're addressing you. So I think that, yeah, you can look at somebody initially, look at Mother Teresa not wearing a habit without any knowledge of her, and maybe catch her like yawning, let's say, and you'd be like, wow, unattractive lady. But as the more time that you spend with her, I think that the more you're forced to either acknowledge the fact that she's beautiful or to run away for fear that she's going to change your heart, you know? And sure, you can even think of like medical reasons if you want to get down to the, I don't think this is too reductionistic, but like if you're at peace with God, there are a lot of things that are going well, just psychologically, emotionally, even physically. So you probably don't have the same, you can tell when somebody's anxious. You can tell when somebody's not sleeping. You can tell when somebody is just weather-worn and haggard on account of the fact that they just can't make it through the day, or they can barely make it through the day.
Right.
But somebody who's at peace with God has found a way to accompany Christ in his, way of the cross, and to do so with a kind of joy, with a kind of joie de vivre. And that, I think, you can actually perceive in a human visage. You can't necessarily account for it. You're like, wow, that person who is very sick unto death seems happier than they ought to be. You can probably say it in just that degree of certainty, but yeah, I think you can perceive it just a little bit, but maybe not more than that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what I want to try and do here is move from the physical, maybe into the spiritual, then talking about eventually music. So I want to see how these three categories Aquinas gives us hold up. So when we talk about a saint like Mother Teresa, and we say like that's a beautiful person, and what we mean is they're virtuous. How do those three categories work at that point? Proportionality, integrity, claritas. Sure.
So I'm going to run the doctrine of analogy in a big way here. So I'm going to give these a pretty generous interpretation. So don't drill down on me with like analytical, philosophical tools, or else I'll be embarrassed.
Sure.
So integrity, wholeness. So what does it mean for a thing to be whole? Here, I just think naturally of perfection. So perfection, from the Latin per facere, to be made through and through. Basically, each created thing that is made towards its end, like not at its end. So that is to say, us, for instance, we're not made in beatitude. We're made towards beatitude. And so it's part of our life's work and experience to gradually grow in virtue, to come to a deeper knowledge and love of God, and so to have salvation work itself out in our members progressively, more and more. So we come to a kind of wholeness, to a kind of spiritual integrity by growth in virtue, by coming to have a deeper knowledge and love of God, friendship with Christ, that heals what has been broken in original sin, purifies us of certain things that stand in need of correction, and actually elevates and perfects our desires, such that we are just one big meteor of gravitational love hurtling towards the heart of God. So it's just, we need to be progressively built back up, reconstituted, and then made whole and entire. So
that makes sense to me. That makes a lot of sense. What about proportionality, though?
here, I think of the kind of doctrine that Aristotle and St. Thomas both describe of the interconnection of the virtues. So St. Thomas will say that if you have one virtue, you have them all, effectively, with certain caveats and whatever. But for instance, when you have charity, you have all the virtues. So you have all the infused virtues. So when you're baptized, you're made a child of God. Original sin is forgiven. You're given sanctifying grace with faith, hope, charity, with prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, and all of the associated virtues. So they just flood your soul. And the thing is that while you kind of have your own spiritual temperament, and while certain virtues will come to a kind of prominence in your life, the virtues all grow together. So when St. Thomas talks about the interconnection of the virtues, he says that they grow proportionately, and he likens them to the fingers of a hand.
Interesting.
So like we think of certain saints as being conspicuously this or that. Like St. Philip Neri, we associate with being especially joyful. Mm-hmm. Or St. Jean de Brebeuf, we associate with being especially courageous. And so these virtues come to a certain prominence, but they're growing apace with the other virtues because the virtues are so deeply interwoven and interconnected. So in order to posit any virtuous act for the love of God, it needs to be informed by charity. And in order to do anything that's prudent, you need to have the other moral virtues, or else you're not well disposed towards the means at hand. So there has to be a proportional growth, because if you were like, for instance, we can think of a counterexample. If you were to say, okay, so saints do these 5 things. They pray, they fast, they go to confession, they receive Holy Communion, and they read the Bible. Mm-hmm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to master each of these 5 things. All right. So let's say like I'm 20-something years old. I've got about 60 years to live. So I'll spend my first 12 years praying and then my next 12 years fasting. That'd be like kind of bizarro, right?
Yeah,
so if you were to neglect those other things, that would introduce a disproportion into your spiritual life. So there's a kind of balance that comes in our approach to the faith and spirituality, but also in the growth of the life of the virtues that I think makes one beautiful. Because if you experience, and like you encounter some Catholics who have sworn off certain things that don't necessarily need to be sworn off, and they may have their reasons for it, but you're always like a little bit suspicious, like why does that person not do this, that, or the other thing, which is kind of normal and not sinful. It's like, I wonder what's up there. So it's about growing apace.
That's a really great explanation. Thanks for that. That makes a lot of sense. What about clarity?
Right. So this is, I guess, would be like the most inventive. So God is provident, which means to say that he has a notion of how he intends to bring about the redemption of all creation. So God kind of orchestrates this triumphal return of all reality to himself in his divine wisdom through his eternal law. And we can actually share in that. So we can actually participate God's providence. So we speak about it often as the gift of wisdom, that we can actually suffer divine things in our members, that God's providence can be brought to bear on our lives in a way that we experience viscerally and intellectually and spiritually in a way that's thick and substantial and real. So effectively, you can begin to look on your life and know why. You can begin to look on the world and know why. You can begin to look on God and have some faint hint of why. And so the saint, you can see in the features of the saint a kind of quiet security because he knows, because he has seen the living God, and as a result of which he can't depart from him. Because he has the words of eternal life. So the saint actually has this deep appreciation for the intelligibility of God's creation and God's plans at work in his life and in the lives of those around him. And that gives him this kind of radiance, this beauty, this peace, this interior order, which you just find attractive. I just know in my own personal experience, the people that have just impacted me most have been contemplatives, people who have looked lovingly and worshipfully at God and have had some deep and profound experience of him, and that abides in their witness, in their testimony. And I find it like wildly encouraging and just super beautiful. So I think that there's a kind of radiance to the saint in as much as they're wise through God's providence. So
correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like when you were talking about the saints now, you're focusing more on the interior peace that in which the saint exhibits a sort of, clarity. But when you were talking about, non-persons, physical things, you were talking about these things expressing a sort of Intelligibility to the intellect.
Right.
So is that the same thing, or is it slightly different? Or
I think it's slightly different. I think it's analogous because at the end of the day, God is beauty. So beauty is a spiritual ideal, but the thing that's closest to our experience is the physical manifestation. So I think beauty, there's if you kind of compare things at different ends of the spectrum, like the piece of art and then God in his divine life, that it's just the word is to be applied analogously. So the content is partly diverse and partly the same, but there's still a real connection between the beauty of a work of art and then the beauty of God's divine life.
That is just mind-blowing stuff, Father. It's really amazing. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to go to the kitchen, grab a bottle of wine, refill my drink, and we're going to talk about music. Is that okay?
Great.
Okay, one sec.
Give me fuel, give me fire, give me that which I desire. Ooh.
Were you this smart before you became a Dominican, or did you just do a lot of study?
It's just life of the Dominican, man. You sit in your room in like a bad chair, just squinting in bad light, reading old books. So I think it's just Dominican life.
You've got an incredible gift. I'm glad you're on our side. All right, as I pour my wine. All right, real question before you get on to music. You could choose only one alcoholic beverage to drink for the rest of your life and no others. Which would it be?
It would be bourbon,
and why?
America's spirit.
I'd say the same thing. Why?
I would say, so I like the taste of bourbon. High corn content, so sweet,
that's
delicious,
right.
palatable.
As opposed to Scotch, which can be more peaty and more of a winter drink, I find. I like bourbon. In the summer, it's hot outside. You're in Kentucky. I'm in Georgia. So when it's hot and sticky outside, I agree. Like a nice cold bourbon.
Yeah,
sweet.
So bourbon's delicious, and there's a huge bourbon boom in Kentucky too. So people love it, and they're genuinely proud of their bourbon and their horses. So it's kind of delightful just to drink bourbon with Kentucky natives.
It makes you want to be an American, man. Like, I have a porch. I have a rocking chair. I love bluegrass music. There's this band called the Hillbilly Thomists. Maybe you've heard of them.
I've come across them a time or two, yeah.
I actually like to play them. This is it's so stereotypical. It's like so cliche, it's a little disgusting. I sit out on my rocking chair, smoke my pipe, drink my bourbon, and listen to those guys. They're fantastic.
Nice. You just need like a big dog to pet next to you and a shotgun laid across your lap.
I have both of those things.
Done.
I have a black Russian Terrier. Do you know what they are?
I don't know.
I was going to call it Rasputin until I learned of some of his escapades and chose not to
associate him with your family.
Exactly. No, but these things grow up to like 160 pounds. They're ridiculous. He looks like an orc should be riding him.
Wow, that is a powerful image. I thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, let's talk about music. Okay, so first, before people accuse us of being pretentious, what would be some modern music that you find beautiful and that you enjoy in different settings?
Okay. I think, I'll speak first to some Christian music that I've encountered recently that I found delightful. So I went to Steubenville. There's a kind of praise environment there. And I think a lot of Hillsong's music recently, both Hillsong United and Hillsong Worship, I find very delightful. And then just some other Christian artists recently that I've come across or people have mentioned to me that I find really delightful, like Josh Garrels and Arthur Assad and, the kind of the folks associated with them. And then just going to Steubenville, there are a number of folks who recently have been cutting tracks and just making beautiful music. Like, I don't know if you heard about I think it's called the Vigil Project. And then there's some folks with whom I was at school, like Alana Boudreau and Hyder.
I love Alana. You know her as well. Yeah, she's a champ.
So, yeah, there are folks that are making beautiful music. And that to me is, because anyone who encountered Christian music in the 90s was exhausted and wrote it off.
Jesus is a friend of mine. Jesus is my friend. Jesus is a friend of mine. I have a friend in Jesus. Jesus is a friend of mine.
And then, it seems like last decade, people discovered that scriptural texts are helpful for the composition of sacred song because, hey, it's been done and it's beautiful. But then it seems like this most kind of like recent wave, a lot of people are just doing like existential lectio on their life. And it has the kind of quality of scriptural revelation in as much as it's deep, Christ-centered. It's actually something that's been prayed through and digested and is able to be communicated. And I love that. It just kills me. Because some old Christian music, it was like you could replace Jesus' name with the name of a past girlfriend and it would make just as much sense. Yeah, exactly. And it's like,
what
yikes.
a beautiful name it is, the name of Sally. Yeah, sorry.
Hey, that's Hillsong.
I actually really like Hillsong. I really like their latest album. I forget what it's called. It has that sort of universe-looking thing on the front.
Oh, yeah. What is that called? Wonder. Yeah. There's some cool tracks on that.
Absolutely. For me, I would say I've been listening to John Mayer a lot lately. I find his music beautiful.
Nice.
This does sound pretentious, but I actually like listening to some opera. I like listening to Gregorian chant.
All right.
But if I'm going to work out, I really like Metallica. I was a huge... Okay, so here's a confession, Father. I know you can't absolve me over a podcast, but when I was about 14 years old, we were in charge of picking the music for Mass. And unfortunately, Mass was a really banal experience, and no one was interested. The priest may have been, I'm not sure. And we had to choose the music, which we didn't actually play. We just pressed play on a cassette player, okay? Yeah. So check this out. Have you ever heard of Hero of the Day by Metallica?
No.
They're off to find the hero of the day. It's pretty awesome. I love it. I absolutely love it. But
Power ballad?
That is the song that we chose for the final song. I am so disgusted with myself, and if Jesus doesn't let me into heaven, I'd be like, nah, that's fair. That's fair.
I pray that he spares you that.
Yeah,
but,
I don't want him to dub me Unforgiven, if you know what I'm saying.
So I dub thee
Wow.
Seek and destroy me or anything like that. Okay, so but no one taught us, of course, what was appropriate liturgical music and those sorts of things. But I think there's a time and place for that sort of music. Like I actually did a workout today. And I just cranked Metallica. Yeah, if I'm listening to Gregorian chant, I'm no way near as motivated. And I heard you say that like if you're working out, like music like that, you can kind of almost get it out of your system. But if you're like sitting on the couch listening to death metal or something like that, tell me what you meant by that. I thought that was really interesting. Yeah.
So when I run, I usually listen to EDM, so electronic dance music, and I have a sweet spot for tropical house. So my brother introduced me to it, and I find it super delightful. So it's it's like upbeat. It's synthetic music and like a MIDI keyboard. So you're rocking pretty good and delightful vocals. So I basically use that for the purpose of working out, which everyone experiences just intuitively. It's like, yeah, I need to get pumped for this workout because I feel like death. And I'm going to fall asleep in a pool of my own sweat if I don't listen to something that amps me up. So, yeah, everyone just listens to music because it engages your passions. It gets your blood flowing, it gets your heart pumping, and it kind of gets you in a little bit of a trance-like state. So that why, if you're running, you're not thinking like, wow, I'm at 168 beats per minute and I feel like I'm going to die. And 5 years ago, I could do this with one leg and whatever. Yeah, so it's just better, all around better. And I find that when I stop running and cut the music, it's not something that recurs. It doesn't haunt me. I don't like have those tunes stuck in my head. But when I listen to fast-paced music, when I listen to EDM, when I'm just about the house, that music does haunt me. So like when I'm going to sleep, I'll be still jamming even a little bit. And then sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and it'll still be playing. I just find it difficult to turn off because, it engages and it's supposed to be embodied. And without it being embodied, it just kind of tends to rattle around more than I'd like it to.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And I mean, I was big into heavy metal as a teenager. And I mean, it felt like the whole point of heavy metal was to kind of engage your rage, as it were. Like it's to give an outlet to your anger and rage, which was like a cathartic experience. But certainly I would say certain Metallica songs are beautiful. I'm not sure if you've listened to any of their instrumentals. Master of Puppets, I forget the instrumental, Orion, I think it's called. yeah, there's some stuff that's like gorgeous. You know, I almost feel I've actually had a few people tell me that it was Metallica's instrumentals that got them into classical music.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah. So I'll have to share one of their songs with you because I am a fan. But okay, so can we actually say this or that piece of music is unbeautiful, and that be an objectively true statement?
I think so. Yeah, we can recognize it with so take music where it's completely atonal, but not intentionally. So it's just somebody just mashing around on a keyboard, and or somebody who just rented their first violin in third grade and they're upstairs practicing.
Sure, good point.
And it's just rough. So what's happening is that there's a certain rhythm, and then there's a certain sound. There's a certain whatever melody or harmony that's being produced. So technically, it qualifies as music in a very, very base sense, but it lacks what is essential to a properly beautiful thing. And so I think we can say that that's ugly. Yeah, without hesitation.
Yeah, that's a good point. I had a friend, my next door neighbor growing up he was learning to play the bagpipes, and his mum would always send him outside, and it sounded like he was strangling a cat. My dad always said. Well, yeah, that's good. And then I'm also thinking of that song "Poker Face" by what's her name?
Lady Gaga.
Yeah, you know that's yeah, it's very kind of I don't know if it's beautiful. It might be interesting, but to me personally, it doesn't seem beautiful. What do you think is the most beautiful music?
So this sounds like a stock answer, but like polyphony and Gregorian chant, I think. So to get back to our three criteria for the evaluation of beauty, or for at least the description of beauty, I think that with certain music, you actually are able to experience this clarity, this radiance of an intelligence addressing an intelligence. And people often harp on the fact that there's a very close connection between music and arithmetic or mathematics, and you have some experience of this thing as deliberately done by an intentional mind when you are able to perceive the very gentle blend of melody and harmony, of rhythm and whatever syncopation, or even just how the lyrics are made to fit with a kind of like word painting on the line of the music. When you're able to perceive the presence of an intelligibility, when you're able to perceive something that's rhythmic in a balanced way, that's not just a show of how quickly I can play the drums, or I just got drafted into this wedding band and I'm going to, spin my sticks as much as it's physically possible. And you can also perceive that the music itself is intelligent. So it's not just like a stock ripoff of some old track that you're repurposing. Then I think those are able to kind of break through in a way and leave you breathless or cause you to wonder.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about liturgical music. So I've been thinking about an argument for why we should listen to Sacrosanctum Concilium when it says that we ought to give pride of place to Gregorian chant, right? And here's the argument, which I haven't really fully fleshed out. Maybe you can help me. So to someone who would, and I'm not opposed to other forms of music in the church, I think being a faithful Catholic means not only submitting to what the church teaches authoritatively, but also not demanding uniformity where the church allows diversity of opinion or custom. But like I think most people would recognize that you should have a proper altar and not a card table. That you should have like a golden dish to hold the Holy Eucharist and not a Tupperware container. And so I think when you talk about these different items, you recognize that there's a certain dignity to these particular things, like they're objectively better. Like obviously a marble altar is objectively, maybe not obviously, but objectively better to a card table. That a golden tabernacle is objectively better to say like a what do you call them in America? We call them eskies, like a cooler.
Igloo. Yeah, sure.
yeah, right. So it's like, well, now can't that be true with music? Like if it's true with all these other things, can it be true that there's a type of music that's actually superior to other forms of music in the same way that these other items can be superior to, other forms, and therefore shouldn't we use that just like we should use those superior objects?
So
yeah, you feel free to rip that apart. I haven't.
No.
I'm thinking it through.
I'm gonna zoom out for a second and say like so. a lot of your approach, I think a lot of one's approach to the liturgy is conditioned by how the liturgy is revealed and how we receive it. So you may have heard, like a lot of people will draw the distinction between the Mass as sacrifice and then the Mass as like communal meal, as it were. So sometimes people will draw the distinction between the vertical and the horizontal, or perhaps the more like hieratic versus the more customary or closer to experience. And so there is this kind of tension in the Mass that we are worshiping the Most High God, and it's more true to say that we can describe how he is not than what he is. So there's this kind of negative theology at work in the mystery of communal worship, but also there's a sense in which the Eucharist makes the body of Christ. So we are made, head and members and brought together. So there's some way in which the Mass actually affects that unity, principally through sacramental reception of Holy Communion in a state of grace. But also like the liturgical worship itself is meant to do that by, communal responses to prayers, by the uplifting of voice and song, etc. So there is this tension at the heart of the liturgy. And I think that we experience that in a very concrete way when it comes to like the language that we use. So this was a big thing, in 2010, 2011, with the most recent translation of the third typical edition of the Missal. So to what extent should language be hieratic, or to what extent should it be closer to our experience?
Interesting.
Should we know God as like a kind of, as more so transcendent and otherworldly, or should we address him in a kind of lingua franca, something that's more akin to our experience? And I think the decision was made, in that to have something that's more proper to worship, which goes to your argument of like, there are certain things that we do in Mass just because they're meant to be better, So like if you look at a lot of the things that we use in Mass, there's no real practical purpose for them. Like vestments. I just love the fact that we wear vestments. It's like, what in the world? Like, who came up with this stuff? But it's to set aside this as distinct and beautiful, as cultic, as sacrificial, as good. And so too, like you said, of the altar or the paten or the ciborium or the chalice or the tabernacle, they're all made beautiful, ornate, decorous, so as to indicate that this is the temple of the Most High God, and that worship conducted therein should reflect the sublimity of the mysteries encountered. And so that plays its way out into language, that plays its way out into music. And so I think that a lot of the times the debates center on whether it should be more exalted and transcendent or whether it should be closer to our experience. And I think that's something that a community discerns corporately together, like where are you? And where do you want to be, and how can your deliberations as a body bring about a more profound, a more perfect worship of God? But I think that like the reason that the Church recommends polyphony and Gregorian chant is in part for the reasons that you described, that these are especially holy things, that these are fit praise, that these betray a deep intelligibility, and that they're just woven within the tradition of the Church's worship and prayer, and inextricable from the sacrifice of the Mass to a certain extent. So yeah, that's a long answer, but short answer, yes.
Yeah, and we're actually beginning to see this in the Church, like even in young adult circles. Like, so when Focus puts on their national conferences, you were there. I met you there. Apparently, I don't remember you. Apparently, your clarity wasn't striking me as hard as it should have, which probably had to do more with the receiver. Anyway, but yeah, like you notice like their music is really beautiful. Like they're really putting in an effort to make the Mass sacred and not something that feels like a rock concert. Like this is. Like, okay, so maybe I'm just old and curmudgeony at this point, right? But I actually don't enjoy Steubenville masses, like big Steubenville conferences. Like, I speak at them, but I find them brutal because it's like there's a violence that feels like is happening in the liturgy. And this isn't a condemnation, and I'm not even saying it's wrong to do. This is just my personal opinion, which I think is right. Because, you go from like, amen, and then the music kicks in. You're like, what is happening?
Was that Jock Jams Volume 1 that I just heard?
I don't even know what that is.
Okay, perfect. Moving on.
Maybe. It may have been. But yeah, like I don't like that. And I don't know. It's like, I'm also aware that we tend to react to something we grew up with, right? So like my perhaps parents' generation reacted maybe against the Latin and the Gregorian chant, and then we went all the way out there. And now maybe there's a tendency to react against that. But then at that point, I'm like, well, then just do what the church says. Like this, just what about that? Like, shouldn't we take that into consideration? And if she is saying polyphony and Gregorian chant, then like, do that.
Right. Yeah, I think so. A couple of things on that. One is I think some people are justly suspicious of a kind of idolatry of the ancient. There's sometimes in certain circles there can be a belief that just because it's old, therefore it's better. Mm-hmm. And I think that what can get lost in that shuffle is the capacity of the people of God to continue to encounter Jesus Christ and to be shaped by that experience and then produce beautiful art. So like what is so unique and mind-blowingly astonishing about the Christian faith is that we claim 2,000 years after the fact to have a personal relationship with the only begotten Son of God, incarnate in human flesh, glorified at the right hand of the Father, that we can actually know him and have a friendship with him, and that changes the whole of our life. And so we can live something, like we can live the life that's actually transfigured. But as a result of which, Christ's grace is living and effective in each generation of the church. And he's inspiring each generation of the church to produce beautiful things for the worship of God and the building up of a Christian culture. And now, mind you, there are certain periods in time that were especially graced in this regard, and we should afford them a due esteem. But we can't look beyond our kind of duty, our sacred or obligation to continue to encounter Christ, to encourage an artistic culture, and to produce things worthy of worship. And so, like, that's why I think it can be unhelpful just to quash all efforts. And that's not to say that like some music is bad, for sure. But when you quash all efforts, sometimes you stifle a creative spirit that would otherwise have developed along healthy lines or beautiful lines. And so a lot of this is just touched by the fact that we are beings in history, that we are made towards the end, not at the end, that we're discursive, that we have thoughts that progressively unfold, and our experience with Christ is always kind of coming to a deeper and more profound appreciation of the mysteries at stake. So like, it's just going to take us time to produce beautiful art. And I think that you see that, you know?
Yeah, I was just about to make a joke about Hegelian dialect, but I'll refrain. Here's a quote from C.S. Lewis I want you to comment on. I just saw it today, never read it before, blew my mind. He said this: "The modern habit of doing ceremonial things unceremoniously is no proof of humility. Rather, it proves the offender's inability to forget himself in the right and his readiness to spoil for everyone else the proper pleasure of ritual." Is that a little combative? You don't want to go there, do you? I feel like...
No, I love it. I think, there is, as a priest, you encounter this too in the celebration of the liturgy. There is a certain freedom in the rite itself because people are thereby more free to encounter Christ and less so kind of tripped up by your own conspicuous presence.
Yeah.
So I think that a good priest just disappears. Not in like a Buddhist annihilation sense, he's like absorbed into the world soul. But I think that his instrumentality makes him transparent to the work of God in the liturgy. And so I think a lot of times there's a kind of anxiety that we need to make Mass especially engaging in a this worldly way, or else we're going to lose the young people, or else people will write it off as unhelpful, insignificant, like passé. But at the end of the day, the Mass applies the merits of Jesus Christ, from Calvary, through his glorified humanity in the sacramental species to the souls of those who receive. And the sacrifice itself offers fitting worship to God after the manner that he prescribes. So it's like, yes, objectively speaking, there is just an incredible amount of grace that's just flowing right down Main Street. And would that we had eyes to see. Yeah, we're like sin-soaked and absolutely world-weary, and we just don't have the energy to even look up and appreciate what's at stake. But like, that is the work of our life. The Lord gives us an entire lifetime to appreciate that better and better, and then an entire eternity to worship in its fullness. So I think that a lot of the anxiety of like invention or the need for novelty is born of a kind of lack of trust that God is working within his church, that he's working within his sacraments.
Yeah, awesome. What would you say, we'll begin to wrap up here, you've been very kind to be on this show for this long. So what would you say to somebody who's maybe a music minister, or maybe somebody who's involved in the church, improving the music if they had the chance? What should they do? Like, unless you're kind of going to a extraordinary form Mass, trying to learn Gregorian chant might seem very difficult. And maybe you want to do that,
Yeah.
I should point out, I don't know if you know this, I go to a Byzantine church. I'm a refugee from the banal liturgies that surround me. And my family and I have been going to the Byzantine church for 3 years now. And
Okay.
so you try to bring a guitar in there, they will smack you in the face.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen. So how would one, as a music minister, enrich his or her life of worship? Well, they certainly host conferences throughout the United States for precisely this purpose, where people far more competent than I can speak on the matter and help you, get you set up with resources and get you set up with friends, which I think is the most important thing. Because a lot of times people who feel like they're fighting a battle feel that they're doing so alone. That's decidedly not the case. Like if you're committed to doing things beautiful for God, then you have, many friends in the church, and even just meeting them at a conference like that can be very heartening. One of my favorite books is The Man Who Was Thursday, and by G.K. Chesterton. And there's this hilarious setup that needs not explaining. But basically, at one point, the protagonist discovers that somebody who he thought was his enemy is in fact his friend, and this is the first friend that he's encountered in the entire story. And so Chesterton says something like, "I concede to the mathematicians that 4 is twice 2, but 2 is not twice 1. 2 is 2,000 times 1. A kind of friendship for the sake of beautiful things can be super enriching. And then you can kind of bounce ideas off each other and encourage each other in your own respective work. I don't know that I know this stuff well enough to really name names, but Adam Bartlett, I think, is producing a lot of things in Lumen Christi. The stuff Adam Mundelein is super beautiful. And, there's like Parish Book of Chant, which makes chant very accessible to a parish community. There are a variety of things. If one would only ask, they are legion. They are myriad. So yeah, I might just leave it at that.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just feel for a lot of us, you're around my age. I feel like many Catholics feel like orphans, like we weren't given the heritage like our parents may have been given it. And so we were raised without, I was raised, in a Catholic home, but without the rosary, didn't know what that was till I was 17 after my conversion. And, never smelt incense in church. There was none of these things. And I just felt like I want to go to a liturgy where my hunger for God is taken seriously. And this is me on the couch at this point, so here I am so I feel like when I go to Mass and there's like this jokes from the pulpit, too many, or the priest says something like, well, we'll get you out early tonight because the football's on, which I've heard multiple times. I just think, I feel offended, I just feel hurt. Here I am with my hunger for the divine, like the one time in the week where the universe is meant to seem in order. And when it feels like it's in disarray, it's really sad. I feel like a lot of young Catholics feel like that. Maybe it's just the circles I hang out in.
No, I think, not necessarily to speak to the particular deficiencies of any one liturgy, but I think that...
No, let's name names right now.
Exactly, yeah, let's call people out on the carpet. There's a sense in which earthly liturgy will always be difficult, right? So, for instance, I don't know if you've had this experience, but for the first time that I tried to celebrate an octave deliberately, it was in religious life. So in the novitiate, you have... your principal work is to convert and to become a human being. And so we celebrate the liturgy with a certain care and devotion. And so for Christmas, you're celebrating Christmas like it's 1963 for 8 straight days. And after day 3, I was just weary because my frame just could not support the weight of glory. I just found it almost oppressive. I just wanted to be back to the mundane, to the simple, to the this worldly, because I just, I don't yet have the light of glory whereby to inform my mind to be in the presence of something that's transcendent. And so I think that we will always experience some kind of tension in liturgy this side the grave, because we will always be up against the fact that our worship is imperfect.
Yeah.
Christ perfects it for sure, and he fills up what is lacking in the prayers that we offer. But there is always a hunger kind of born of our restlessness until our voices are joined to those of the heavenly choir, and we stand before the throne of the Lamb and sing Amen, Alleluia for the rest of our days. But it's good that we're restless here, because otherwise we wouldn't hunger divine liturgy of eternity. So it's just part of the wild, merciful way in which the Lord continues to goad us unto heaven.
So that's beautiful. Now that I've sounded like a rad trad, let me try and speak out the other side of my mouth here and say that I find that when people have an overemphasis on how the liturgy, the Holy Mass ought to be celebrated, like the size of the candlesticks and this and that and this, and it's almost like this anger that you feel coming out of people as opposed to like a delight in the liturgy. I often wonder if it's not, and maybe this is true in my life, I think it has been in the past, where due to an interior disorderedness, I want to be able to fix what I can. And so rather than kind of being at peace with myself, I try to make everything perfect and end up even more agitated.
Yeah, that certainly may be involved. There's also like a sense, too, in which, zeal for his house will consume you. There is a pious tradition in scriptural literature of defending holy things. There's a sense in which everything down to the very appurtenances of the temple are given a particular care. I mean, like, I'm not to defend the people who get angry about the length of candlesticks and stuff like that, or who just bark at you if you get too close to the communion rail. Not to say anything of that, but like, I can see how love is comprehensive and love wants to be wholly given. That's the whole spirit of devotion, which I want to be prompt about my self-offering in such a way that it renders the whole person. And that in the incarnate order means giving everything good to God and being particular about its care. And this is a particular grace of sacristans that most people don't otherwise experience. But like, yeah, I mean, I think that can be a form of a very beautiful devotion. But yeah, as you mentioned, it can assume perhaps less savory or fallen shapes. Yeah. So,
well, this has been so great, and as I said, and I mean it, I'm so glad you're on our side. You're a really intelligent bloke, and you got a lot of great things to say, and you're super relatable, which is great. Usually uber smart people. I interviewed a few people recently who were uber smart, and after the interview, I'm like, "There's no way I can post this because the guy was so dry." Yes, Matthew. Well, I suppose that you could say. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so bored. I want to sleep right now in the interview." So that's a real gift, and glory to God for the work he's done in your life. Tell us how people can learn more about you, listen to your talks, read what you've written.
Sure, yeah. Let's see. I'm at St. Louis Bertrand Parish in Louisville, and we have a podcast where we put our content up from our RCIA class, our lecture series, the talks that we give to our young adults. And you can find that on SoundCloud or on any podcast app. It's called Kentucky Thomism. So yeah, just search Kentucky Thomism. And then, I've been reassigned for this upcoming year. So I'll actually be moving to Washington, D.C. to work for the Thomistic Institute. So you can also check out the Thomistic Institute has its podcast again on SoundCloud and then any podcast app. And that's just Thomistic Institute. So yeah, lots of good content. The Kentucky Thomism is the more relatable younger brother of the Thomistic Institute. So Thomistic Institute
what's Pints with Aquinas then? If you're the relatable younger brother,
you're like the family wild child.
I'm like the drunk guy in the corner. Hey, what's that? Hey, how you doing?
The crazy uncle who kind of lures you in and tells you 25-minute yarns.
Yes, that's it.
Nailed it. So yeah, the Thomistic Institute podcast is a little more academic. It's kind of geared to college students who have an interest in theology and graduate students. And then Kentucky Thomism is geared to your parish audience.
Yeah, I listen to both podcasts and get a lot from both of them. So I couldn't agree more. Hey, by the way, have you heard of Basil Hayden's whiskey? Bourbon?
I have, yeah.
Do you know, somebody told me this recently, that it was designed by a Catholic, and so it's meant to represent a priest's chasuble?
I didn't hear that. But, hold on one sec.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
You're getting kicked out of the library, aren't you?
I am getting kicked out of the library, but it's okay because I got 10 minutes. I had not heard that about Basil Hayden.
You know the look of it, right? It's kind of got.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's what somebody told me. So I don't know if that's true or not, but I hope it is. It's super cool.
Yeah, I'm all for Jim Beam products in general. Jim Beam's is a great company. So Basil Hayden's, Booker's Bakers, it's all good. Knob Creek.
Awesome. All right, brother. Brother. Bless you.
All right.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
All right. Thanks so much for listening through till the very end of this episode. The fact that you have listened through right now, I mean, there's been people who've been listening and they're like, nah, I'm done, and they've stopped. But you have listened right through over an hour now. So that's awesome. If you enjoy the show, which apparently you do, I want to invite you to begin supporting Pints with Aquinas on Patreon if you're not already, because that enables me to put in all the effort that's required to produce and distribute these shows. The way you would do that is by going to pintswithaquinas.com, clicking support. That'll take you through to our Patreon page. And there you can give $10 a month, $20 a month, $50 a month, and you'll see all the thank you gifts that I give you in return for your generosity. That would mean a lot. If you can't afford it, that's cool too. Pray for the show. Pray for those who listen. And maybe leave us a review on iTunes. Cheers. Chat with you next week.
To carry